The first thing Davin noticed about the planet Vel-Nur was that it smelled like rain that had not fallen yet. The air was heavy and green and full of something electric, like the world was always one breath away from a storm that never came. He stood at the edge of the landing pad with his field bag over one shoulder and watched the Dracary guards look at him the way large animals look at small ones, not with threat, but with total indifference. That was fine. Davin was used to being ignored. He was 34 years old, not tall, not loud. He had spent 9 years studying alien biology in places most humans never got approved to visit. He had a habit of writing things down in a small notebook even when he had a recorder running, because he believed the hand remembered things the machine did not. He drank too much coffee and slept too little and found most conversations less interesting than a good data set. The Dracary had allowed exactly one human to be stationed at their conclave outpost on Vel-Nur. That human was Davin. His official title was Xenobiology Observer. His unofficial role, which everyone understood and no one said out loud, was ceremonial, a gesture of tolerance. A way for the Dracary to show the galaxy they were generous enough to let a human stand in the corner and watch. His assignment, spelled out in 3 sentences by the Dracary liaison officer, a long-necked dragon named Orith who had the eyes of someone who had outlived several governments, was simple. He was to serve as cradle warden to a noble hatchling. He was to ensure the hatchling's sleeping quarters remained at the correct temperature, humidity, and light level. He was to report any concerns to the Dracary guards immediately and take no independent action of any kind. That was the whole job. The hatchling's name was Sarah. Davin met her on his first evening. She was small enough to fit inside his field bag with room left over, and she was the color of hammered gold. Not yellow, not orange, but the deep warm tone of old metal that had been worked by careful hands for a long time. Her scales caught the light from the twin moons outside the window and threw it back in scattered pieces. Her wings were folded tight against her back and tipped in silver at the edges. Her eyes, when she opened them and looked at him without blinking, were violet. She looked at him for a long time. Then she tucked her nose under her tail and went back to sleep. Davin pulled up a chair and sat down and opened his notebook and wrote, "Hatchling. Gold scales. Silver wing tips. Violet eyes. Appears healthy. Does not seem alarmed by human presence." Noted. That was night 1. Night 2. He checked on her at midnight the way the duty log required. The cradle was empty. He looked under it. He looked behind the temperature unit. He checked the corners of the room because hatchlings, according to what little documentation existed, sometimes rolled in their sleep and wedged themselves into warm spaces. The room was not large. There were not many places to look. Sarah was not in any of them. He went to the door and opened it and told the Dracary guard on duty. The guard, who was 3 times Davin's height and had been doing this job for what appeared to be a very long time, looked at him without changing expression. "Hatchling's dream walk," the guard said. "She will be back before morning." "Where does she go?" Davin asked. "It is not a place," the guard said. "It is a state. You would not understand." Davin nodded and went back inside and sat in his chair and waited. At some point before the first moon set, Sarah was back in her cradle. He had not seen her return. She was simply there, curled tight, silver wing tips folded over her nose, sleeping without any sign that she had ever left. He wrote in his notebook, "Absent approximately 3 hours. No sign of exit or return. Guard unconcerned. Follow up." Night 3 was the same. Night 4. Night 5. On the 6th night, Davin got up from his chair and walked to the cradle and looked down at the small indent in the bedding where Sarah had been sleeping. Then he crouched down and looked at the floor near the window, the one window in the room that faced the tree line and had a latch that was not fully closed. There were footprints. Tiny, four-toed. The spacing between them was deliberate, not scattered. She had not been wandering. She had been walking somewhere specific, in a straight line, toward the forest. Davin stood up slowly. He looked at the window. He looked at the forest. He wrote tomorrow night. He decided he would bring better shoes. The forest at the edge of the conclave outpost was not the kind of place that made a person feel welcome. The trees were tall and old in a way that had nothing to do with age. They were old the way stone is old, solid and patient, and completely without interest in whoever happened to be walking between them. Their roots rose out of the ground like the knuckles of buried hands. and the space between them was filled with plants that glowed faintly in colors that had no names in any human language David knew. There were things moving in the upper branches. He did not look up at them. He was wearing good boots and carrying a field recorder in one hand and a thermos in the other. The thermos had coffee in it. This was not a dramatic choice. He simply found it easier to think when his hands were warm. He followed the footprints. They were easy to track. The ground near the tree line was soft from subsurface moisture, and Sarah's small claws had pressed cleanly into it with each step. The stride was even. She had not been frightened or hurrying. She had been walking the way someone walks when they know exactly where they are going and have been going there for a long time. Twice, David had to step over roots that were higher than his knees. Once, the ground dipped without warning into a shallow gravity pocket, a place where Velner's twin moon pull created a localized distortion in the soil density, and he felt his stomach lift slightly before he stepped back and went around it. He marked it on his field recorder with a quiet spoken note. It would be useful information later. He had been walking for about 20 minutes when he heard it. Not a sound exactly, more like a rhythm, something between a scratch and a tap, repeated in patterns, stopping, starting, repeating. He moved toward it carefully, one step at a time, keeping his weight on the outer edge of his feet the way he had learned to do years ago in a forest on another planet where the wrong footfall vibrated the root system and alarmed every creature within 50 meters. He came around a curve in the tree line and stopped. The clearing was not large. At its center stood a single enormous tree, wider than any three of the others combined, with bark so dark it looked almost blue in the moonlight. Its lower trunk, the section from the ground up to roughly the height of a doorway, was covered in markings. Sarah stood in front of it. She was on her back legs, barely stable, her tail pressed against the ground for balance, and her front claws were moving against the bark with slow, careful precision. She was carving. Each stroke was deliberate. She would make a mark, pause, tilt her head, and then make the next one. The pattern she was creating was not random. Even from this distance, even without understanding a single symbol, David could see structure in it, spacing, repetition, grouped clusters separated by what looked like deliberate gaps. He stood very still. Sarah stopped. Her head came around, and she looked directly at him. Her violet eyes caught the moonlight and held it. She was still for a long moment, long enough that David thought he had made a mistake, that she would make a sound, that the guards would come. Then she turned back to the tree and continued carving. David let out a slow breath. He sat down on a root at the edge of the clearing, set his thermos on his knee, and raised his field recorder. He did not speak. He did not move closer. He simply recorded. She worked for 2 hours. The markings she added that night covered a section of bark roughly the size of David's chest, and they connected seamlessly to the markings that were already there, the ones that had been carved on previous nights, maybe many previous nights. The lower third of the tree was already filled. When she stopped, she pressed one small claw flat against the bark for a moment, not carving, just touching, and then she dropped to all fours and walked past David without stopping. She did not acknowledge him. She went back through the trees the way she had come, quiet and straight and certain. David stayed in the clearing alone for another few minutes. He looked at the symbols covering the tree. He photographed every section in sequence. He counted what he could count. There were at least 400 distinct markings already visible, probably more under the patches of moss that had grown over the oldest sections. Then he picked up his thermos and walked back through the forest, stepping carefully around the gravity pocket, and returned to his room. He pulled out his notebook. He wrote for a long time. When he stopped, he looked at what he had written and then drew a line under it and wrote one more thing below that. She is not dream walking. She is working. He underlined it twice. Then he started figuring out what she was making. David had 11 nights of photographs, for notebooks filled front to back, and a headache that had been with him for so long he had stopped noticing it. He spread the photographs across every flat surface in his room, the desk, the floor, the top of the temperature unit, and stood in the middle of them like a person trying to read a map that kept changing size. He had arranged them in sequence, left to right, oldest marks to newest, the way a person reads a page. He did not know if the Drackery read left to right. He did not know if what he was looking at was meant to be read at all, in any direction a human mind would recognize. But he was a xenobiologist who had spent 9 years learning to find patterns in things that were not built for him. So he started where he always started. He looked for what repeated. There were 37 distinct symbols. He was confident about that number after the 4th day, and it did not change after that. 37 base shapes, combining in groups of 2 to 5, those groups separated by a smaller symbol that appeared with enough regularity to be punctuation or a divider. Some of the base shapes appeared hundreds of times. Others appeared only once or twice, always in positions that seemed significant, at the beginning of a new cluster or alone at the end of a long sequence. He cross-referenced everything against the Dracari Linguistic Archives humanity had been allowed to access, which was a database about the size and depth of a single encyclopedia volume about a subject nobody fully understood. It was not much, but it was something. On day 7, he found 3 matches. They were not exact. They were what a linguist would call cognates, related shapes, sharing structural elements with known Dracari ceremonial glyphs. The kind of relationship a word has with its own ancient root. These symbols were older, stripped down, more like the idea behind the word than the word itself. He wrote the 3 matches on a separate sheet and stared at them. The first was a glyph associated with origin or source. The second was associated with a cycle or a return. The third, the one that appeared most often in Sara's carvings, was associated with a concept the Dracari archive translated in 2 different places 2 different ways, in one entry as warning and in another as something is coming. David sat back in his chair. He thought about the structure of what she had written. The oldest markings at the bottom of the tree, almost covered by moss now, had a different density than the newer ones. Tighter, more compressed, as if she had started with a great deal to say and very little space. Over time, the marks had become more spaced, more deliberate, like someone learning to write clearly. She had started before she had language. She had been carving this before she had the fine motor control to do it precisely. And she had gotten better at it, night by night, because she needed to. On day 9, David requested access to the Dracari Archives botanical records. The request came back denied. He requested access to records related to ancient Dracari communication methods. That came back denied with a longer response that essentially said this topic was not relevant to his assignment. He went back to his photographs. He thought about what a species would use a tree for if it had no writing system yet. He thought about the size of the tree, older than any structure at the outpost, possibly older than the outpost itself. He thought about the way Sara had pressed her palm flat against the bark when she finished each night, not adding a mark, just touching it. Biological archive, he wrote in his notebook. Not a record for reading, a record for storing. The tree holds it. The tree is the storage. He checked the biology database on his recorder and found a single reference, buried in a footnote of a footnote, to something called a memory tree, a Velner native species of enormous age capable of holding chemical encoded information in its bark tissue, a method the ancient Dracari had used to preserve knowledge before they had the technology to do it any other way. The practice had been abandoned so long ago that most current Dracari scholars listed it as theoretical, possibly mythological. David looked at the photographs covering his floor. He looked at the 3 symbols he had matched. Origin, return, something is coming. And then he did the thing he was best at, the thing the Dracari had never thought to worry about a human doing, the thing that had gotten him sent to a distant planet to stand in a corner and watch. He started connecting the dots. He pulled up every anomaly report in the Conclave's publicly accessible Star Lane monitoring data, the reports the Dracari filed, and then archived without follow-up. He was looking for something specific now. Not a threat, not a weapon, a pattern. He found 7 anomalies in the first pass. Systems where monitoring signals had stopped without debris or explanation. He tagged them. He went back further in the records. He found 4 more. He sat very still for a moment. Then he opened a new page in his notebook and wrote a single question at the top. What did the ancient Dracari know? He looked at Sara, who was asleep in her cradle, her silver wing tips folded neatly, breathing slow. A hatchling with no schooling and no formal language, who had been carving a warning into a tree every night since before she could walk steady. He looked back at the 11 anomalies on his screen. He started writing. Requesting an audience with Orith was not a simple thing. Davin submitted the formal request through the Conclave communication system on a Tuesday. He received an acknowledgement on Thursday. He received a scheduling notice the following Monday, granting him 15 minutes at the end of the week. He used the time between to go over his data 12 more times, to recheck every connection, to remove anything he was not certain of, and see if what remained still held together. It did. It held together better without the uncertain parts. On the day of the meeting, he walked into the conclave chamber carrying a data board, a notebook, and the quiet expression he wore when he had already decided something and was simply waiting for the rest of the room to catch up. Orith was enormous in the way that old things are enormous, not just in size, but in presence. He was the color of deep water under heavy cloud, and he occupied the head of the chamber table the way a mountain occupies a landscape, as if it had always been there and would continue to be there long after everything around it had changed. He looked at Davin with eyes that had seen 800 years of history and had not found most of it surprising. He did not offer a seat. Davin sat down anyway. "You have 15 minutes, Orith said. "I will need 10, Davin said. He laid the data board on the table and brought up the Star Lane monitoring map. These are 11 systems in the Conclave monitoring network that went silent over the last 40 years. He highlighted them one by one. No debris, no energy signature of any kind, no distress signal, just silence. Each one was individually flagged as sensor drift and archived. None were connected to each other. Orith looked at the map. Sensor drift is a documented phenomenon in long-range monitoring arrays. In 1 or 2 systems, yes, Davin said. Over 40 years, in 11 systems, all within a corridor approximately 3 light-years wide, moving at a consistent rate. No, that is not sensor drift. That is a pattern. He pulled up a second layer over the map, a line connecting the 11 silent systems in sequence, showing the direction of movement and the average time between each event. The line moved in one direction, slowly, steadily, toward the conclave. The chamber was quiet. Davin did not say anything dramatic. He did not need to. The map said it for him. "How did you find this?" Orith asked. His voice had not changed in tone, but something behind his eyes had shifted. "I was looking for something specific," Davin said. "The hatchling, Sarah, has been leaving her cradle every night and carving symbols into a memory tree at the forest edge. I followed her. I photographed and analyzed the symbols. 3 of them cross-reference to known Dracari glyphs associated with origin, return, and warning. The oldest marks on that tree are approximately 6 weeks old, which means she began carving before she could walk with full stability." Another silence. Longer this time. "A hatchling cannot access ancestral records," Orith said. "She has had no instruction, no exposure to memory tree practice. That knowledge has not been formally taught in the conclave for over 3 centuries. "I know," Davin said. "It is not possible. She has been doing it every night for 6 weeks. I have recorded all of it." He placed the notebook on the table. Every page was filled. "She is not dream-walking. She knows what she is writing. And what she is writing matches what I found in your own archived data your monitoring teams individually dismissed and never compared to each other." Orith looked at the data board. He looked at the notebook. He looked at Davin. "You are a cradle warden," Orith said. "Your assignment is temperature, humidity, and light levels." "Yes," Davin said. "But I got curious." He said it simply, without apology, the way a person states a fact about themselves that is neither a flaw nor a virtue, but simply a quality they were born with and have long since stopped trying to explain. Orith was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that meant thinking, not dismissal. His gaze moved back to the map, to the 11 silent systems, to the slow line connecting them, to where that line pointed. "What do you believe it is?" Orith asked at last. "I do not know yet," Davin said. "But I know the direction it is moving and approximately how long before it reaches the nearest occupied system on that corridor." He brought up one final layer on the map, a circle drawn in the monitoring data zone parameters, marking the edge of the risk zone. "Which is why I asked for this meeting now, and not in another month." Orith looked at the circle. He looked at it for a very long time. "You followed footprints," he said. It was not a question. "Tiny ones," Davin said. "Yes." Outside the chamber window, the twin moons of Vel Nur were rising. In the forest at the edge of the outpost, An old tree stood in the dark with 400 warnings carved into its bark. A hatchling who had never been taught anything had been trying to tell the oldest civilization in the sector something it had forgotten it needed to know. And a human who had been sent to stand in a corner and watch had been the one paying attention. Orith exhaled slowly. For an 800-year-old dragon, it was a deeply deliberate thing to do. "I will convene the council," he said. "You will present this again. To all of them." David nodded. He picked up his notebook and his data board and stood. "You have time remaining in your 15 minutes, Orith said. "I know," David said, "but I said I only needed 10. He left the chamber. Behind him, Orith looked at the map for a long time without moving. The War Council, because that is what it was, even though no one used that word, met for 6 hours on the first day and 4 hours on the second. David sat at the far end of the table and presented his data twice in full and answered questions for the rest of the time. The Drackery Council members were 8 in total, each one older than any building David had ever stood in, and they looked at him the way the very old sometimes look at the very young, with a mixture of interest and something close to pity. They believed the data. That was not the problem. The problem was what to do about it. "We mobilized the fleet," said one council member, whose name translated roughly as "old stone that does not move. "We send forces to the corridor. We prepare for engagement." "Engage what?" said another. "There is no enemy in the data. No ship signature. No weapon discharge. 11 systems went silent. There is nothing to shoot. Then we fortify the border systems." "Against what?" It went on like that for a while. David sat quietly and drank his coffee and listened. He had learned long ago that in rooms where important people were arguing, the most useful thing a person could do first was listen until the argument had fully run its course. People in rooms like this often already knew what they needed to do. They just needed to exhaust the other options first. He waited until there was a pause. Then he said, "I would like to propose something different." The room looked at him. He was used to that particular kind of attention by now, the kind that is not quite respect and not quite dismissal, but something in between that might tip either way depending on what he said next. "We do not know what is out there," he said. "We know what it is doing. We know it is moving. We know it does not leave debris or signals. That tells us it is not destroying things the way a weapon destroys things. It is removing them, collecting them. Whatever is doing this was built for a purpose, and that purpose does not seem to include communication, because if it did, it would have communicated before now. If it does not communicate, we cannot stop it," said Old Stone that does not move. "We have not tried," David said. "We have never been in its path before. Nothing we know about has ever been in its path and survived to try." Silence. "I want to send one ship into the silent corridor," David said. "No weapons. No military crew. A contact vessel broadcasting on every frequency we know, carrying records of every inhabited system, every species, every signal type humanity and the Drackery have ever cataloged. We go to it before it comes here, and we say, 'These places are occupied. We are here. We exist.'" The reaction was immediate and loud and mostly negative. Words like suicidal came up. Words like irrational. One council member said that this was exactly the kind of proposal a species that had been in space for 100 years would make, and the words were not kind ones. David waited it out. Orith had not spoken once since the session began. He sat at the head of the table and watched and said nothing. Now he raised one claw slightly, barely a gesture, and the room went quiet. "The hatchling trusted this one," Orith said. He did not look at David when he said it. He looked at the map. "I have spent 8 centuries learning to recognize things I do not fully understand. I have not always listened to them as quickly as I should have." He paused. "We will send the ship." They argued about the crew. The Drackery wanted to send warriors as escort. David said no. A contact vessel with an armed escort was not a contact vessel. It was a threat wearing a greeting. In the end, the crew was 7 humans and 1 Drackery observer, a younger dragon named Ferris who had spent 30 years studying non-Drackery civilizations and had the particular quality of being able to sit still in a small ship for a long time without becoming difficult about it. The ship crossed into the silent corridor on a gray morning 17 days later. David was not on it. He had volunteered and been told, with great politeness and complete firmness, that the one person who understood what was happening was too important to send into a situation with unknown survival odds. He accepted this and went back to his room and sat with Sarah, who was growing noticeably larger and had recently discovered that she could knock things off the desk with her tail, which she seemed to find satisfying. The ship reached the edge of the anomaly zone in 4 days. On the 5th day, it made contact, not with a ship, not with a crew, but with an automated signal structure of extraordinary complexity. An ancient program, a machine mind built so long ago that the civilization that made it no longer existed in any form. It was a harvester. It collected stellar matter, gas, mass, raw material, and compressed it for transport back to a facility that had stopped receiving deliveries approximately 1 million years ago. It had never been told to stop. It had no protocol for inhabited systems because when it was built, the systems in its path had not been inhabited yet. It was not malevolent. It was not curious. It was simply running the last instructions it had ever been given, with the patience of something that did not experience time the way living things do. The human crew spent 72 hours studying its signal architecture. They barely slept. They ate whatever was in the supply bag closest to hand. At the end of those 72 hours, they found its input frequency, the channel on which it still received commands, and they sent a message. The message was very short. It said, "The systems ahead are occupied. Living things are there. You were not told about us. We are telling you now." The harvester paused. It processed for 11 hours. Then it rerouted. The new course took it away from every inhabited system in the corridor, a wide arc into empty space, toward regions that had no recorded settlement, where it could continue its work without consequence. It acknowledged the correction the only way it knew how, by updating its own navigational record with a new variable it had never carried before. Inhabited. Do not collect. The crew sent one transmission back to Velnur. It was 4 words. We talked to it. Davin read the transmission in his room, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and his notebook on his knee. Sarah had climbed onto his shoulder at some point and gone to sleep there, which she had never done before. She was heavier than she looked. He did not move her. He wrote 4 words of his own in his notebook, underneath the transmission. Of course we did. Then he closed the notebook and let the hatchling sleep. 3 months after the harvester changed course, Velnur held a ceremony. The Dracari did not hold ceremonies the way humans did. There were no decorations, no music, no food on long tables, or speeches written in advance. What the Dracari did, when they wanted to mark something as permanent, was gather in the oldest space available and say the thing that needed to be said in front of witnesses who would carry it forward. The memory tree clearing at the edge of the forest was chosen. Davin was not told why until later, when Ferris explained that selecting a memory tree site was the Dracari way of saying, "This will be recorded in a form older than language." Sarah attended. She was bigger now. Her head came up to Davin's shoulder when she stood on all 4s, and her golden scales had deepened in color to something richer, the tone of afternoon light on old bronze. She sat beside Davin throughout the ceremony with the dignified patience of an animal that has decided a situation is acceptable and sees no reason to make it otherwise. The ceremony elevated humanity from observer status to full partner in the Dracari conclave. It was the first time in 2,000 years that a non-dragon species had been granted that recognition. The council presented it without excessive language. They simply changed the record, added the notation, and considered it done. Afterward, when the other council members had returned to the outpost, Orth stayed. He stood beside Davin at the edge of the clearing and looked at the memory tree, at the hundreds of symbols covering its lower trunk, small and precise, carved by a hatchling who had not yet been formally taught any language at all. "You followed what no one else thought worth following," Orth said. It was as close to a formal acknowledgement as he was likely to give, and Davin understood that. "She knew something," Davin said. "I just wanted to know what." They stood in silence for a moment. Not an uncomfortable silence. The kind that happens when 2 individuals from very different backgrounds find themselves briefly at the same place in their understanding of a thing. "The ancestral memory phenomenon in her carvings," Orth said quietly. "Our scholars have been studying your documentation for 6 weeks. They believe she is not unique. They believe this capacity exists in all Dracari hatchlings at a dormant level, a biological record-keeping instinct that was present before we had formal language. It was never lost. We simply stopped looking for it. He paused. We had stopped looking for many things. David nodded. He did not say anything to that. Some observations did not need a response. That evening, after the conclave personnel had dispersed and the outpost had settled into its usual night routine, David walked back to the clearing with Sarah. She walked beside him, unhurried, occasionally glancing up at the twin moons. She was big enough now that her wing tips, when folded, cleared the top of his shoulder by several inches, and each footfall made a soft sound in the dark soil. At the memory tree, she stopped. She looked at the symbols she had carved over the past months. All of them, from the oldest compressed marks near the bottom to the most recent, cleaner lines near the top. She stood in front of them for a while in the way she sometimes did, not touching, just looking. Then she raised one claw and carved something new. It took less than a minute. One symbol, clean and deliberate, placed at the upper right of everything else she had written. A position of conclusion, David would later learn, the Drackery equivalent of a signature or a closing mark. Then she walked past the tree, curled up in the moss at its roots, tucked her silver-tipped wings over her nose, and went to sleep. David photographed the new symbol carefully. He did not try to interpret it that night. He sat on a root nearby and finished what was left in his thermos and let the forest be quiet around him, and for once he did not write anything at all. The symbol took 6 months to translate properly. David could not do it alone. The image circulated eventually to 3 Drackery language scholars who initially declined to look at it, then became interested, then became completely consumed by it the way scholars become consumed by things that are not supposed to exist. The symbol was archaic enough that direct translation was not possible. What they arrived at, after 6 months of careful collaborative work, was an approximate meaning. A concept, not a word. The one who walks small but sees far. It was an honorific. The oldest in the recorded Drackery language, so old that no verified use of it existed in living memory. The scholar's notes said it had been given, in the ancient record, to individuals who found the things that everyone else had already decided were not there. David kept the photograph in his field journal, tucked between the page of his first notes from Velnur and the page where he had written, in slightly unsteady handwriting on a night when he was tired and the forest was very dark. She is not dream-walking. She is working. On the first page of the journal, from the night he arrived, there was another photograph, the first one he had ever taken on Velnur. A set of tiny golden footprints in dark, soft soil, leading away from a window and into the trees. He had not planned to keep it. He had taken it as documentation. But when he went back through his records later and found it, he left it where it was. Some things you take a picture of without knowing yet that it is going to be the most important picture you will ever take. Sarah slept under the memory tree with her wings folded and her breathing slow, the way small creatures sleep when they are safe and have done what they needed to do. The twin moons moved overhead. The forest made its usual sounds, rustling and distant and alive. David closed his journal. He had been sent to guard a cradle. He had not expected the cradle to guard the galaxy in return. But that, he supposed, was the thing about paying attention. You never quite knew where the footprints were going to lead.